My name is Jasmine Porter, and I was 26 when I realized my own family treated my apartment like a hotel lobby with no front desk. It started with tiny, wrong details that only the person who lives there every day would notice. A pair of sneakers I always kicked off by the door suddenly lined up neatly against the wall. A mug I left in the sink sitting rinsed on the counter. The faint smell of fabric softener I didn't use hanging in the hallway. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but the air felt used, touched. At first I told myself I was being paranoid. I worked long shifts near the resorts in Orlando, came home exhausted, and sometimes I did forget where I dropped things. But then I opened my fridge. There, on the middle shelf, was a glass container of casserole I didn't cook, next to a stack of neatly packed leftovers I definitely hadn't paid for. On top was a sticky note in handwriting that wasn't mine, calling me by a nickname I hadn't used since high school. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Someone hadn't just stopped by, they had made themselves comfortable. My parents had a spare key for emergencies. My sister knew exactly where they kept it. Somehow, that combination had turned my place into a revolving door I never agreed to. I was the last person to know when someone had been inside the one space I could finally afford to call mine. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Later that evening, my brain finally caught up with what I had just walked into. In the quiet of my Orlando kitchen, the air felt wrong, as if another person's day had brushed up against mine and stayed behind. Nothing looked broken, but nothing felt untouched. That sense of someone else moving through my space pressed down harder than the heat outside. My mother, Sheila, had been the one to push for a spare key when I first signed the lease. She called it a safety net, a way to sleep at night knowing I was not completely on my own. Back then, I was so relieved to afford a small place near the resorts that I agreed without thinking. Saying yes to that key had seemed easier than saying no. Now it felt like handing over a piece of the front door. My younger sister Marissa had always been comfortable around boundaries that were supposed to be firm. As kids, she slipped into rooms she had been told to leave alone and treated limits like suggestions. The idea of her knowing there was an easy way into my apartment made my skin prickle. There was a difference between sharing a hallway bathroom as teenagers and having her routine spill into the one part of my life that finally felt like mine. I picked up the note left on top of the food and read it again. The handwriting looked warm and familiar, the same loops and hearts she used on lunchbox notes when I was 10. There was no question anywhere. No line asking if this was okay. It read like a recap, not a request, a summary of something she had already decided to do. Calling her felt like the obvious next step, but even tapping her name on my screen made my chest tighten. When she answered, her voice had that bright, efficient tone she used whenever she believed she was being the perfect mother. I told her I had come home to find clear signs someone had been inside while I was at work. She confirmed it immediately and sounded proud of herself for helping. To her, dropping off food was pure generosity. She said she had been thinking about how hard I worked near the attractions and how often I joked that I lived on takeout and cereal. In her mind, the spare key existed to fix those problems. She could not see the quiet violation in small changes and cleaned dishes. She saw only her own intent and the story in her head about taking care of me. I tried to explain that whether or not she meant well, walking into my place without warning was not okay. I said it made me feel like my apartment was on loan instead of mine. On the other end of the line, I could almost hear her shrug. She told me I was being dramatic, that family should not need an invitation, that worrying about my privacy sounded like something I had picked up from online posts. By the time the call ended, my pulse was still elevated, but a part of me wondered if I really had made a big deal out of nothing. The food meant I would not have to order another greasy meal after a long shift. The kitchen looked cleaner than I had left it. Those facts tried to soften the edges of what had happened, and for a few days I let them. I stacked the containers, ate the leftovers, and told myself the unease in my chest was just me adjusting to living alone. The second time it happened, there was no way to lie to myself. It was a Saturday morning, late enough that sunlight had already warmed the balcony, and the sound of traffic from the nearby attractions floated up to my window. I dragged myself out of bed, planning coffee and a slow shower before work. The moment I stepped into the bathroom, the hair on my arms stood up. On the shelf inside my shower sat a bottle I had never bought. The label faced forward like it belonged there. The scent was expensive and sharp, a salon brand I had only seen in other people's bathrooms. One glance at the color and the shape, and I knew exactly whose it was. Marissa always cared about small luxuries, fancy hair products, coordinated outfits, the right gloss. As kids, we fought because she scattered her things all over the shared counter and called it getting ready. Seeing that same energy in my single bathroom apartment snapped everything into focus. Someone had not only come into my place again, they had showered, unpacked toiletries, and left without a word. I checked the towel rack. One of my clean towels hung slightly crooked, still damp at the bottom edge. The bath mat sat in a different place than I remembered. My toothbrush had been nudged to the side. Every small change added weight to the same realization. It was not just my mother dropping by to help. My sister had turned my home into a convenient crash pad without even thinking to ask me first. The anger that rose this time felt different. It was heavier, less confused, less willing to be talked down. The first incident could almost be filed under a misunderstanding. This one exposed a pattern. The spare key was not a safety net. It was a door they believed they could walk through whenever it suited them. A few days later, I decided talking on the phone was not enough. Driving out to my parents' house felt like slipping backward in time. The closer I got to their quiet street outside Orlando, the more my new life as someone with her own lease and utility bills faded in the rearview mirror. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were tight on the steering wheel. I did not rehearse speeches. I walked up the steps, rang the bell once, and waited. Mom opened the door with the surprised smile she used when neighbors dropped by. She reached for a hug, but I stepped past her and headed for the kitchen. Years of dinners and arguments had soaked into those walls, and my feet knew the path by heart. My younger sister Marissa sat at the table scrolling her phone. She looked up with a quick grin and a lazy wave, as if I had come over just to visit. Before either of them could fill the silence with small talk, I turned to face them. "I want the spare key back." The words came out flat, more like a line item than a request. For a second, nobody moved. Then Mom's expression hardened. Her brows dropped and her mouth tightened in a way I knew too well. "Why? It's for emergencies." She threw the word out like a shield. She talked about anything that could happen to a young woman living alone near the tourist area. Late nights, storms, car trouble. Every example was framed as another reason she deserved access, not a reason to leave my front door under my control. I told her an emergency meant something rare and urgent, not an empty fridge or a messy sink. I said I did not feel safe knowing people had come and gone without telling me. The look she gave me was not concern. It was hurt wrapped in indignation, the same look that had ended arguments when I was a teenager. Marissa finally put her phone down. She leaned back in her chair, studying me like I was overreacting to a minor inconvenience. "We're only trying to help you," she said. "You work all the time. Mom just wants to make sure you eat and don't burn out." To her, helpful people did not need permission. Gratitude was supposed to be automatic. I looked from my sister to my mother and realized they were perfectly aligned. In their minds, my apartment was an extension of this house, another room they had the right to walk into. My father, Raymond, came in from the garage wiping his hands on an old towel. He glanced around, sensing the tension. Dad had always been the one who could talk Mom down or convince Marissa to compromise. Part of me hoped he would do that now, to say out loud that moving out meant having a door that answered only to me. Instead, he listened while Mom said I wanted to take their key away. She left out the details that made everything feel invasive and presented it as me turning my back on family. When she finished, the room went quiet again. I repeated that I needed the key, that my place was not a shared resource, that I could not relax knowing anyone else could open my door whenever they chose. He sighed, the tired, disappointed kind that used to precede lectures about responsibility. "We're not giving it back," he said. No anger, no raised voice, just finality. If even he thought my need for privacy was unreasonable, there was nothing left to negotiate. They did not see adults when they looked at their daughters. They saw extensions of themselves. The rest of the visit blurred. Mom cycled through tears and sharp comments. Marissa went back to her phone, shaking her head like I was ridiculous. Dad moved around the kitchen, acting as if the decision had been made and the matter settled, pouring coffee and setting out snacks as though this were any other afternoon. I stayed long enough to know nothing I said would change their minds. On the drive back, the late afternoon sun hit the windshield so hard I had to squint, but my focus felt sharper than it had in weeks. They were not going to hand back control. If I wanted to feel safe in my own home, I would have to take it. That night, I sat at my small table with my laptop and a notepad, searching for locksmiths who worked weekends. I wrote down names and numbers, then circled one that seemed reliable. I checked reviews, imagined a stranger swapping out the metal that had let my family in so easily, and felt a small knot of determination settle in my chest. Changing the lock would not fix the way my family thought about me, but it would close at least one door they believed still belonged to them. By the next afternoon, I had a locksmith booked. He checked my ID in the hallway, laid out a small roll of tools, and went straight to the deadbolt. The clicks against the metal sounded louder than they should have in a one-bedroom unit. When he finished, he handed me 3 new keys. They looked ordinary, but the difference felt huge. The old lock had been a door my family believed belonged to them. This one answered only to me. Changing a lock should have been routine. For me, it felt like drawing a line my parents refused to see. I wanted to come home after late shifts near the Orlando attractions and know that if anything in my apartment had moved, it was because I had moved it, not because someone else had decided my space was theirs to manage. After he left, I took the elevator down to the leasing office. The assistant property manager looked up from his computer when I walked in. His badge read Evan Cross. I told him I had paid to replace my lock and needed my file updated. I kept the story as clean as I could. I lived alone. I had changed the hardware, and I did not want anyone allowed into my unit unless I personally requested it. The more I spoke, the harder it was to keep my voice even. I said someone had already let themselves in without my knowledge. Evan listened, then tapped through a series of screens. He explained that the complex kept a master key for fires or flooding, not for convenience, and that staff were not supposed to unlock an apartment just because a relative asked. When I asked what happened if someone claimed I was sick or unreachable, he stopped typing. "Technically, we still say no," he said. "People can make anything sound urgent. If you like, I can put a note on your account so there's no question. No access for anyone but you." Hearing that from someone who barely knew me felt steadier than any apology I had pulled from my parents. I told him yes. He added a brief line, then turned the monitor slightly so I could see my name beside the words, "Authorized resident only." For the next week, my days finally looked the way I had imagined when I signed the lease. I went to work, came back past the same billboards and souvenir shops, and unlocked my door with the new key. Inside, nothing shifted without my hand on it. My phone still buzzed with messages from my mother and my sister, but I did not answer everyone. The quiet made it easy to believe the worst was over. Maybe hearing that the lock had changed and that the office had a note on file had convinced my mother there were limits she could not bend. I knew better than to trust that completely, but for a few days I allowed myself to exhale. Then, on a Tuesday evening after a double shift, the illusion cracked. I pushed my door open with the new key and stepped into cool air. The lights were off, the blinds half closed, the mail still stacked where I had left it. Then a faint floral scent drifted in under the hum of the air conditioner, something from a candle I did not own. In the kitchen, the trash can had been emptied and re-bagged. The pan I had left soaking that morning stood dry on the rack. On the counter, next to my own grocery bag, sat a stack of takeout containers from a restaurant just outside my parents' neighborhood. The bolt and frame were intact. The key still turned smoothly. But my bedroom door stood open, and the bed was made more tightly than I ever bothered to make it before work. A sweater I remembered dropping over a chair now hung in the closet. My mail had been separated into two tidy piles. On the coffee table, centered like a display, lay a handwritten note. The rounded letters were instantly familiar. This time, there was no pretense of hesitation. She wrote that she had spoken with the front office, that they understood a mother's concern, that she had worked it out so she could get in if she needed to check on me. The phrase sat on the page like a stone. Somewhere downstairs, in the same office where I had watched Evan type authorized resident only beside my name, someone had heard her version of the story and chosen to unlock my door anyway. My family had not just crossed a line themselves. They had found a way to bend the building around their idea of what they were entitled to do. Standing in the middle of that carefully straightened room, I realized I was no longer fighting over a spare key. I was fighting against the belief that my comfort could be traded away as long as the person doing it said it was out of love. The next morning, I went straight to the leasing office. Evan looked up as soon as I walked in. Whatever he read on my face made him stand. I set the note from my kitchen table on his desk. The paper lay between us like proof that the line we had added to my file meant less than either of us thought. He read it, then asked who had let my mother into the building after he had flagged my account. I told him the note said she had worked it out with the front office. Evan checked the log of key usage and the visitor sign-in sheet. He found an entry from a weekday afternoon with my last name misspelled and a vague description in place of identification. Someone at the desk had decided a worried parent deserved access more than the person paying rent did. He apologized in a way my parents never had. He said the staff member who had unlocked my door would be written up and retrained, then added another note to my account in capital letters, the kind that did not leave room for interpretation. He offered to email me a copy of the new notation so I could see exactly what the system said about my unit. Walking back upstairs, I realized something important had shifted. The building was finally on my side. My family was not. For a few days, the knowledge that at least one barrier would hold made it easier to sleep. I started locking the chain inside the door, a habit I had never bothered with before. When footsteps passed in the hall, I paused and waited for them to move on. One late afternoon, after a shorter shift than usual, I pulled into the parking lot in my work clothes and headed toward my building. Near the gate, two familiar silhouettes stood far enough from the keypad to look casual. My mother and my sister lingered in the shade, eyes flicking toward the entrance each time someone approached, waiting for a chance to move. I stopped behind a parked car and watched. An older couple pushed a stroller to the gate and typed in the code. As soon as the lock buzzed, Mom stepped forward, caught the door, and held it open with a practiced thank you. Marissa slipped in behind her without touching the metal. Neither of them had used a key. Sliding through a secured entrance was not clever. It was stubborn. They had driven across town and stood in the heat until a stranger opened the way into my building. Locked hardware and capital letters in the computer system meant nothing if my family was willing to stand outside until they could ride in on someone else's access. I waited until the gate shut again, then used my own key. On the third-floor landing, I paused. Voices drifted through my door. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Footsteps moved across the floor in slow passes. When I walked inside, they were in the living room. My mother had rearranged the throw pillows and folded a blanket I kept draped over the back of the couch. Marissa's tote bag sat open on the armchair, half full of clothes and makeup, as if she were unpacking for an overnight stay. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. Mom commented on how tired I looked and asked if work was wearing me down. Marissa picked up a pair of heels that were not mine and asked where she could leave them so they would not be in the way. I told them again that they could not come and go like this. I said I had changed the locks, spoken to the office, and made it clear I was the only person allowed in the unit. Mom waved that away, saying the gate had been open and that she was doing me a favor by cleaning up. Marissa said she needed somewhere closer to the part of town she liked to go out in at night, and that my place made sense. In their version, I was stubborn and ungrateful. In mine, they were standing in the middle of my home explaining why my boundaries were less important than their convenience. Even as I repeated that this was unacceptable, I knew I was arguing with people who had no intention of changing. After they left, the quiet did not feel peaceful. It felt fragile. I walked from room to room, noting every object they had moved. The couch they sat on, the door they entered through, the hallway where they had slipped past other residents who thought they belonged there. By the time the sun dropped behind the buildings, the conclusion I had avoided for months finally settled. New locks, office notes, and conversations were never going to be enough. As long as my family knew where I lived, they would find ways to cross the line and call it love. The only thing I could change that they could not bend was the address itself. Within a week, staying where I was stopped feeling like strength and started feeling like a dare. On breaks, I scrolled through apartment listings, skimming past photos and looking for interior hallways, controlled entries, and addresses on the far side of town. I wanted a place my family would not pass by accident. One listing on the edge of Orlando stood out. The pictures were plain, but the description mattered. Residents entered through a locked lobby, guests had to be buzzed in from upstairs, and the office did not hand out codes as a courtesy. It sounded less like a resort and more like a building that believed doors should stay shut. During a morning tour, the leasing agent talked about appliances and parking. I asked how they handled people who arrived insisting they needed to check on someone. She answered that unless a name was on the lease, staff could not release information or unlock anything. That policy felt more reassuring than anything else she showed me. I filled out the application that day and signed the lease before I could talk myself back into staying put. Moving across town would not put me beyond reach, but it would put me somewhere my family did not know to look. I told Dana and Nina. They had never met my parents or my sister. When I explained what had been happening in my current place, they listened without trying to excuse it. Their questions were practical. When did I need the van? How much could we carry? What time of day would be quietest? We chose a weekday morning and rented a moving van. I filed my notice with my current complex online and marked the move-out date on a calendar in a drawer. Each night, I packed a few boxes and slid them into my bedroom closet so there would be nothing obvious to see if anyone decided to drop by before I left. On moving day, the air outside was heavy before the sun cleared the roofs. Dana backed the van up to the stairwell. Nina took lighter loads while I carried heavier ones, each trip down the steps unwinding months of tension. I kept glancing toward the parking lot, half expecting to see my mother's car, but the spaces stayed filled with strangers' vehicles. Evan crossed our path once as we moved the last boxes. He asked if I was transferring to another unit. I told him I was moving to a different complex, and thanked him for taking my concerns seriously when I had asked him to lock down my file. Before he walked away, I asked one more thing. If my family came by after I left, I wanted them to hear only that I no longer lived there. He said that once I turned in my keys, there would be nothing on record staff could share with anyone who was not listed as a resident. I took it as a boundary written into the system instead of just into my voice. By midday, my apartment was empty. The walls showed pale rectangles where frames had hung. The counters were wiped clean. I walked through each room once more, making sure I had not left behind anything someone could hold up later as a reason to call. At the office, I handed over my keys and signed the move-out form. I repeated my request that no forwarding information be given to anyone who asked, even if they shared my last name. The clerk nodded and marked the unit as vacant. The new place was smaller, but when the lobby door clicked shut behind me the first time I walked in, the sound felt solid. I carried a box into the empty living room and set it down, noticing my own footsteps. Settling in took a few days. I built a bookcase, arranged dishes, and learned which headlights belonged to neighbors and which belonged to passing traffic. My phone lit up with calls and messages. Some were casual, others were sharp, demanding to know why I was not answering. I let them stack up without responding. A few days after the move, an email from Evan appeared in my inbox. He wrote that 3 people had come to the old complex asking for me and insisting they were family. They wanted to know where I was and whether I was safe. The staff told them only that the unit was empty and that no information could be shared. According to his message, my mother raised her voice. My sister paced the lobby, and my father pushed for details until the conversation ended. Reading his description, I could picture them in that office, angry that a building treated them like strangers at a closed door. The distance between their expectations and my reality was no longer just in my head. It was in a policy and a log that did not bend for them. I closed the email and set my phone face down on the table, letting the silence between us grow a little more. A few days after Evan's email, I finally answered a call from a number I knew by heart. My mother started talking before I could say hello, saying they had gone to my old complex, that no one would tell them anything, that the staff had treated them like strangers. When she stopped for air, my father took over, asking if I was safe and where I was living now, and why I had moved out without telling them. Together, they sounded less like people checking in and more like people demanding a report from someone who had stepped out of line. This time, I did not rush to explain myself. I told them I was safe, that I had a new apartment across town, that the office knew not to share my information. I said I had asked the old complex to refuse details to anyone who was not on my lease, and that the staff had done exactly what I requested. There was a short pause. Then my mother asked why I would make it so difficult for my own parents to reach me, and said that if I had just given them a new key, none of this would exist. The familiar labels followed: ungrateful, dramatic, cruel. My father said I was taking things too far, that family did not treat each other this way. My chest felt tight, but my voice stayed even. I told them that what they called help had felt like inspection, that walking into my home while I was at work, letting my sister use it as a stopover without asking, slipping through the gate behind strangers after the office had been told no, were not acts of care. Those choices told me they did not see me as an adult with a door of my own. My sister spoke up then, louder now. She said everyone she knew leaned on family, that I was turning independence into a performance, that I should be grateful anyone wanted to show up for me at all. Her version of love still required me to be open on demand. I did not argue with her examples. I said I was done reliving the same conversation. I told them I had moved to feel safe in my own space, and that I would not be giving them my new address. I added that, if they tried to track me down through my workplace or my building, I would treat it as harassment, not concern. The word changed the air on the line. My mother began to cry. My father sighed the way he did when I was grounded as a teenager. My sister muttered that I was unbelievable. I let their reactions land without taking them as proof that I was wrong. Before I hung up, I told them one last thing. If they ever wanted a relationship with me again, It would have to be on different terms. No keys, no surprise visits, no more treating my home like shared property. Phone calls only if invited. Messages that did not demand instant answers. No more pushing past the word no. Until they were ready for that, I needed distance. Then I ended the call and blocked their numbers. Afterward, I tightened the rest of my life around that choice. I locked down social media, changed privacy settings, and asked a few trusted friends not to give out information about me without checking first. It was strange to build walls against people whose faces filled every photo album in my childhood home, but it was also the first time my sense of safety did not depend on their mood. Time moved on without them. I worked, came home, learned the sounds of my new building. Some holidays I spent with coworkers who had nowhere else to go, others alone with takeout and whatever movie I felt like watching. Now and then, an email slipped through from a cousin or an aunt saying my parents were hurt and confused. I replied once with a single sentence, "I am safe. I hope they are well. I am not ready for contact." The consequences for them were not dramatic or cinematic. They kept their house and their routines and their stories about being good parents. What they lost was access. No spare key to borrow, no Orlando apartment to treat as a convenient landing pad, no way to step over my threshold just because they felt like checking on me. The consequence for me was quieter but real. I had to grieve the parents I wished I had and the sister I wished I could trust with a door code. I had to accept that some people would rather lose you than learn how to respect you, and that I could not shrink myself small enough to fix that. I do not think cutting contact is a simple solution or the right answer for everyone. There are families who listen when you say no, who learn, who change. If you have that, I hope you hold on to it. But if you do not, I hope you remember that you are allowed to draw lines, even with the people who raised you. Wanting privacy does not make you ungrateful. Wanting safety does not make you cruel. If any part of my story feels familiar, I hope it gives you permission to take your own needs seriously and to plan your boundaries instead of apologizing for them. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If you feel like sharing, I would like to hear how you think about family and boundaries. And if you want to hear more stories like this, I hope you stick around for the next one.